Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This quote finds itself inscribed on the Statue of Liberty, a greeting of encouragement for immigrants coming to the United States. Immigrants primarily from Europe, where they had no chance to own land, change their social status, and faced famine and disease. These immigrants set their eyes on America, where it was believed that land was just ready to be given away to any who claimed it. Rumors told of American streets paved with gold, both literally and metaphorically, symbolizing the opportunities to climb to higher rungs of the social ladder. Immigration has been a long-withstanding topic of debate in America, and in the 1840s, immigrants often found themselves arriving in a new land, tired, poor, and yearning to be free. That yearning that brought them to seek out a better life did not always work out as planned, and families that were all too commonly destitute found themselves broken apart, seeing the children of these families placed for adoption in states far to the west. Missouri would be one of these states that would gain an influx for adoption, as trains brought these orphans to the Show Me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. Show me, show me. I am from Missouri. Show me.
I'm from Missouri.
Show me, show me.
You're listening to the Show Me podcast with your host, Chris Cowan.
I'm from Missouri.
Show me, show me, show me. I am from Missouri. Show me.
I'm from Missouri.
I am from Missouri. You have got to show me.
In the first half of the 19th century, immigration largely came from Europe, so it was only natural that these immigrants arrived in East Coast cities like New York and Boston. A large influx of immigrants with a limited supply of jobs created economic hardships that saw these immigrants facing many of the same challenges that they faced in their homelands. In some cases, parents were unable to provide for their children and placed them in orphanages, planning to return for their children at a later and more prosperous time. Other children would be taken from their parents as drugs and alcohol entered into the mix. And some children would find themselves as orphans, with both parents deceased and no extended family willing or able to provide care for them. While some children ended up in the orphanages of large East Coast cities, many, many more would not. Known as street Arabs in New York City, these children would later be portrayed as upbeat and adventurous youth who lived a carefree life. Sure, they may steal a loaf of bread or pick a pocket to find their next meal, but they were free, at least in their portrayal. The reality of this situation was often much, much darker. These children faced dangers from the elements, starvation, competition with other street Arabs, and imprisonment for crimes as just a few challenges to their survival. In order to try and overcome these obstacles, the children of the streets would try to find money through various means. One stereotype that held a degree of truth was as paper boys, but darker avenues were often explored, and many orphaned girls, and sometimes boys, resorted to prostitution to survive. By 1849, New York City's chief of police, George Matzel, had seen enough of the vagrant and abandoned children that plagued the streets of his town. Chief Matzel knew that these children often broke the law, but he also understood the reason why. Matzel found the situation created two possible problems. The first is that these kids had placed themselves in difficult situations. The second was the belief that resorting to criminal actions at an early age could lead to a future of harsher criminal activity as these children reached adulthood. New York City and other urban centers in the East lacked the facilities to care for the ever-growing number of children that flooded the streets. something needed to be done to try to combat this social issue. And in 1853, something began that would impact the lives of roughly 250,000 children. It's believed that roughly 100,000 of these children would find their homes in the Show Me State. Founded by Charles Loring Brace, New York's Children's Aid Society would be established with the intent on finding new homes for the masses of the street Arabs and would be funded through the donations of New York businessmen and charitable philanthropists. Brace believed that through removing these children from detrimental environments and relocating them to places where they could work and thrive would make them valuable members of American society. Brace thought that the farms of the American frontier were plentiful enough to support farmers and the orphan children who were sent there, and they would also provide needed manpower to assist with farm chores. He viewed it as a win for both the fostering farmers and the children in need. Posters across the Midwest declared, "Wanted, homes for children," with newly built railroads promising to help disperse these children in need to families out west that could provide the care that they were denied in the larger cities of the American East Coast. Flyers from groups such as the Children's Aid Society, the New York Foundling Hospital, and other groups would precede the trains themselves, advertising the impending arrival of groups of children who were either orphaned or came from homes deemed unfit. These flyers would be dispersed along communities that had railroad access, and East Coast organizations would decide upon routes, issue flyers to be sent along beforehand, and follow with a train of children passengers shortly afterwards. An agent of the Children's Aid Society would accompany upwards of 40 children on their journey, making stops at the predetermined destinations where prospective adoptive parents filled out applications that were often either approved or rejected on the same day that the children arrived at the train station. In 1854, the first orphan train would depart for Michigan, followed shortly thereafter by other trains to other states, including Missouri. Although the orphan trains were started with honest intentions, there were critics of the program, especially in the first few years of operations. America was struggling with the issue of slavery, and the Civil War was still years away. Abolitionists felt concern that the orphan trains were being used to force children into indentured servitude and de facto slavery. Those in the pro-slavery camp viewed the program as an abolitionist scheme to destroy slavery, replacing the need for slaves through a workforce of children. Others viewed the program in a negative light for religious reasons, with the Catholic populace drawing concern over children being placed with non-Catholic families. For the Children's Aid Society, they did their best to place children in Christian homes, but attention to denominations was not always adhered to or focused on. This would see Catholic organizations such as the New York Foundling Asylum develop, and in 1875, the New York Foundling Asylum would begin to send out orphan trains of their own, with one massive difference. They would send children after homes had been found and secured through parish priests, whereas the orphan trains operated by the Children's Aid Society would see kids travel from town to town, hoping for adoption at each stop, and if no foster parents were found, they were returned to New York City. The nature of the fostering system developed through the orphan trains suffered a tragic flaw. The people who accepted these children into their homes were often poor or middle-class farmers and laborers who could not afford to care for more than one child. This resulted in the further destruction of families, as siblings were commonly split apart from each other and found adoption through separate families, often losing all contact with their brothers or sisters for decades at best, or in the worst-case scenarios, for life. While life on a farm or small Missouri town may have been more pleasant than a life on the streets of New York or Boston, there were still hardships to deal with, even when children were lucky enough to be placed with a loving and supportive foster family. One obstacle came from other children who often viewed the orphan train riders in derogatory ways. They would tell the riders that nobody loved them, not even their parents loved them, implying that their parents hated them and thus placed them up for adoption. Many of these children were ostracized and not accepted by the community, but not all. In some communities, such as Taos, Missouri in Cole County, orphan train riders made up a significant percentage of the children in the area, providing them with a shared experience with which they could connect and relate with one another, allowing for bonds to develop in almost a sibling-like manner. Others found struggles in foster families deciding that they no longer wished to care for the child, forcing the representative agencies such as the Children's Aid Society to find a new home for the children, not always for the best. Some children found abuse in their new homes, and stories emerged of forced labor and inadequate food being provided for the orphan train riders. Fortunately, these reports were in the minority, and many children were properly taken care of, but there were enough negative stories to garner attention. Fearing that eastern states were dumping their problems on the people of the Show Me State, and that the trains may not be in the best interests of the children involved, Missouri would pass legislation in 1901 that outlawed orphan trains. This legislation would name the Children's Aid Society specifically, stating that the group disposed of other states' unwanted children and dumped them in Missouri for Missourians to deal with. Lawmakers felt as though the Children's Aid Society thought of Missouri as little more than a dumping ground, but people throughout the state would disagree, and the laws passed against the orphan trains were never enforced. The trains continued to enter the state, bringing in children for nearly another 30 years. The 1901 law against the orphan trains, though not enforced, would not be the only legislation passed that would ultimately lead to the end of the orphan trains, however, and these other laws can be seen as a positive aspect of the foster care and adoption system as they developed in America. These laws would enact protocols for fostering and adoption that were more stringent than the previous and sometimes lax rules of the groups who used orphan trains. These policies would be one aspect to the end of the orphan trains, but would not be the only factor. In 1929, the Great Depression would strike the American populace and strike it hard. Many of the Midwestern families, like those who had fostered and adopted before, would find themselves poverty-stricken and struggling to get by, rendering them unable to take in additional children. Thankfully, by this time, eastern states and cities had improved their own handling of children in need, allowing for more orphans and foster children to remain near the homes that they knew instead of locations hundreds of miles away. Increases in social programs were also enacted to assist needy families, seeing less children placed into orphanages as a means to alleviate financial strife on poor eastern families. Just how much of these factors contributed to the end of the orphan trains is unknown, but they all certainly played a hand in the end of the orphan trains. In 1929, the orphan trains would come to an end, with Trenton, Missouri being the final destination. Just what brought the orphan trains to a complete stop isn't entirely clear, but it can be said with certainty that improved social programs in the 1920s and those following in the early 1930s, along with adoptive legislation, definitely provided nails for the coffin of the orphan trains. Although the orphan trains ended, the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Asylum did not. Now respectively known as the Children's Aid and New York Foundling, both groups continue to work in the realm of foster care and adoption. The New York Foundling would also expand into the areas of juvenile justice, assistance for deaf children, and provide programs for those with developmental disabilities. Children's Aid continues to assist in multiple programs that benefit the lives of children. Not only were they the first to make use of orphan trains, but they would be the first to develop parent-teacher organizations, free school lunch programs, and the first kindergarten programs in America. Both of these groups remain highly respected nonprofit organizations. And while the trains that brought orphan children to Missouri may have ended, these organizations developed the first foster care agencies in the United States, seeing them evolve into the foster care system that we know and use today. And while there were positive and negative aspects and experiences with the orphan trains, perhaps the most important realization was coming to understand the importance and value of foster families. This importance is often overlooked in today's society, as there are currently over 437,000 children in the American foster care system alone, and over 12,400 of these are children in Missouri. Linking back to the past, modern estimates state that 1 in every 25 Americans has a connection to an orphan train rider, and many of these connections and the riders that inspired them are often an overlooked but important part of the Show Me.
This program is copyright 2019, the Show Me podcast. No part of this program may be duplicated or reproduced without the written consent of the Show Me podcast. Music used in this program is Creative Commons Media.
From Missouri.
Show me, show me, show me. I am from Missouri. Show me, show me. I am from Missouri. You have got